Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, few natural phenomena do damage as quickly and as fiercely as tornadoes. This week we had 6 in one day. We'll look tonight at what happened, as well as the media coverage and the plight of eastern New Orleans. There was a wet day of a different sort in the news as the state's rainy day fund became part of the discussion for the upcoming special session. We'll examine that, as well as resolution in Tom Benson's family legal struggle, and the City Council takes a stand on the president's travel decree. Going our way are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Tyler Bridges, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate; Kathy Finn, freelance journalist and author of a recent book about Tom Benson; and Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio. And we go to Dave first to talk about this spate of tornadoes that we had, and one that is just a record breaker and a heartbreaker.
Yeah, it's so unusual. You know, I guess the saving grace is that there were 6 tornadoes, and 5 of them before the massive EF3, the unprecedentedly large tornado, got to New Orleans East, because it really seems like people listened to the warnings. They were ready. They had gotten off of the roads. They had gotten in their bathtubs, in their closets, in their interior rooms. They were taking cover. And if they hadn't, when such an unusually large tornado for an urban area, let alone this far south, struck, that 2-mile path of destruction from that tornado, to see it, you just look and go, people had to die. This had to be a killer tornado. But no, everybody survived. And it may be because as they were listening to the coverage, watching the coverage, seeing it on their phones and on their computers and tablets, I think people were going, it's coming this way.
Well, also, as you noted, it hit during the daytime. And so we're there in New Orleans East, where it just really slammed New Orleans East, people were at work. They weren't at home for the most part. So that probably did save a lot of folks.
Couldn't have hurt, but even at work, look at Nassamishu.
Right.
People there watched walls of buildings blow away and thought that the world was coming to an end, because when that twister got to that point, it was pretty dramatic out there at the assembly facility.
Right, at the finance center, the Federal Finance Center.
And we've never seen an EF3 in the city of New Orleans before. These are the type of tornadoes we see in the Midwest, on the plains. These are the kinds of the big, wide, wedge tornadoes that we don't experience down here, thank goodness, most of the time. Usually the tornadoes we see here look like just a little tiny, skinny, almost like water pouring out of a faucet. And they do minor damage. They're EF zeros. They're generally very weak, and they're not terribly destructive. This one was nothing like that. 140-mile-an-hour winds. It was big and wide. It stayed on the ground for at least 2 miles. And the path of destruction is unprecedented based on the strength. And again, there was another EF3 that hit, thank goodness, largely in swampy, more rural areas, but there were 3 people injured by that. There were 6 tornadoes in all, and they hit in Killian, New Orleans East, Harahan, Donaldsonville, Watson, and Holden. And that nobody died is really a testament, I think, to people's preparedness.
As you said, this was just such a big, wide tornado. When you look at video of that, and people were shooting video of it as it was approaching, I can only imagine what people were thinking when it was coming their way. But you never see that in this area. That was really amazing to see.
Yeah,
that size storm.
And during the coverage, we were marking that the National Weather Service described it as a large, extremely dangerous tornado. Those are words we don't normally see from the National Weather Service in the advisories and the warnings they send us, because we are here in the Deep South, where the conditions rarely are just right for that. But we asked the experts, why? Why did we see not only so many tornadoes, but such an unprecedentedly strong and large tornado down here? And they say it's just because of the different climatological conditions we have now. It's been warmer. We had all that warm, moist air, and when the system came down that was triggering this, it was just exactly right, or wrong, as the case may be, to allow for the formation of those kinds of storms.
So are they blaming it on global warming?
I haven't heard anyone come out quite and say that, but it has been unusually warm. And that is a contributing factor, that at this time of year, when we have that cold weather coming down, normally we see that kind of, conflict between the cold and the hot, and that's what causes the unstable atmosphere. But now it was just the right kind of ingredients to cause this.
Well, let's talk about New Orleans East and the area that was hit. Could you describe exactly where? Because most people have not gone down there because they shouldn't be.
Sure.
That has to be taken care of by the folks who live there.
You can see it from the I-10. If on the I-10 at the Chef exit, it's set down really first at Chef and Michoud, at that intersection. And it hopped almost like back and forth across the street from one side to the other. And so you'll see houses on one side where there's a number of them gone, turned into nothing but shards of glass and splinters of wood. But then a house next door untouched because it veered. The funnel cloud actually moved across the street. And so you'll see there a church gone, a business gone. But then there's another house that just lost the roof. And as it goes on for 2 miles through neighborhood after neighborhood, some industrial, some residential, and it's the aerial shots we were able to get from drone video, which is, such a great opportunity we now have to not have to bring a helicopter out, put a drone up. The video from those drones, you just see, as the mayor put it, it looks like a massive elephant just stepped on one house after another and crushed them. And we've heard many stories from survivors about how they did get in the bathtub, they did get in the closet, they did pull their car off the road and get inside as quickly as they could. Now, there were a few people who pulled out their cell phones, of course, and started, filming. And in some ways that's good because we have lots of video of it. In other ways, it's kind of scary. One individual actually drove alongside it and was filming the whole time. And you question the wisdom of that, perhaps. But it's great to have that footage now so they can study it and see what happened. The recovery is going to be difficult. Power's still not back on to about 3,000 customers over there. They hope to have it all back on by tomorrow night, at least at the homes that are stable enough to accept the electricity, that have been deemed safe to do that. But it's going to be a long recovery out there, and we all know that's an area that was hit hard by Katrina.
It was. I mean, our hearts just go out to all of those folks who are now facing this again. It's such a cleanup.
What these people have? Is it the same sort of situation with Katrina, like with FEMA help? And
not even close. It's so different. Because it's such an isolated kind of a disaster when a tornado hits, unless it's one of those that you see up north where an entire city is wiped out. It's going to be a much slower process to make those federal determinations about any help that comes from the federal government at all, if there is any. The good news is the insurance department tells us that 90% of Louisianians have coverage for tornadoes, unlike flood damage, which less than half have. In this case, almost everybody had coverage on their homeowner's insurance, and almost everybody impacted had homeowner's insurance. Now, there are some older individuals, particularly those who already paid off their mortgages, who elected for like a fire-only policy, so they may not have the wind coverage from a tornado. But by and large, they all have private insurance, and that's the good news in this case, that private insurance, and we've already seen the kindness of charities, strangers, and others coming out to help, that hopefully they'll be made more whole more quickly than in a hurricane or a flood where they have to wait on the federal government to eventually maybe send money if they didn't have flood insurance.
Well, you noted that people were warned and probably took cover, and also, and we certainly saw the media on top of this too, warning people as well.
Yeah, it was an interesting story as far as the news coverage, and I think there were 3 tiers of coverage. The first was, I believe this was the first time, and certainly in my case, where a lot of people experienced finding out about a major news story like this through their iPhones, and who got that emergency blast. I didn't even know my iPhone could do that, and all of a sudden this blast came. I think a lot of people had the same experience. Because this happened around mid-morning, it was after drive time, when a lot of people might have been in their car listening to radio, or when the early morning TV shows were on. It was in that mid-morning period. So people may not have been alert to the media at the time. So I think it was the iPhones that alerted a lot of people. When they did that, then I think instinctively they probably turned on their radio, listened to Dave on WWL. WWL really has the only news team for a radio station. But some of the other radio stations, the so-called iHeart radio stations, carry Channel 8's coverage too. So in all between what WWL was doing independently and what the other 5 or 6 stations were doing carrying Channel 8, I guess there were 6 stations that were doing continuous coverage. The TV stations, once you got to the TV stations, they have all this great technology now, all of these, all these maps and these charts and these various things where they can, and it's amazing how they can really pinpoint where things are now. I mean, of course, using the weather service. And so I think that was part of an incredible thing where you can see this coverage and say, in 10 minutes from now, it's going to be right here. So overall, I mean, if you look at all of that was out there, I think it did a good job. And as you were saying, when you talk about the fact that nobody was killed, I believe it because there really was a good media structure out there that informed people.
Well, media and technology, you hit on that not only do the television stations have the best technology they've ever had through upgraded radar systems, more cameras everywhere that they can tap into, either their own or that others that they have agreements through, or even the state has cameras all over the interstate system and all that. But the Weather Service has the best technology it's ever had in terms of satellite and radar. But the phones have now, all of the carriers have now integrated their systems with the National Weather Service's system. And the Weather Service, not too long ago, started being much more specific. Rather than just saying there's a tornado warning for an entire parish, they will now pinpoint for northwestern parts of this parish, affecting the cities of, and it'll list the cities. That information now can be integrated with the individual cell phone carrier systems. They can see where you are right now by pinpointing the location of your phone. If the location of your phone falls under that warning area that's far more compact now, thanks to the technology the Weather Service has, they can, whether you want it or not, make your phone start alarming. And a lot of people heard that for the first time with these tornadoes, because they had never, luckily, been in a situation where they needed it before. But now they can get so close to telling you where that actual tornado is and make your phone alarm go off so you know to take cover.
First time I ever heard it and saw, when I looked at it, saw a tornado warning. First time I ever saw that. I mean, I live here in New Orleans. We just are not used to that. I think we're all going to pay real close attention now when we hear about severe thunderstorms.
If ever there was a disaster that an iPhone is good for, it's a tornado because it is so instant. A hurricane, is coming, a few days ahead of time and it's on the way. But this, it was just marvelous the way it performed. But to make it work, it needed the partnership with. They needed a place to go, and I think radio became important too. This was radio's show, and then radio could also get people to turn the TV and look at the pictures. So I think the combination of the three mediums really did an effective job.
Yeah, and we know people took their radios or their phones with the apps so they can listen to the radio or watch television into the closets or into the bathtubs with them. And so they at least didn't feel like they were just wondering what's happening. They could actually hear and, in some cases, watch on their phone as it was unfolding.
Quite an event, and we wish the best for everybody in New Orleans East. The community has to come together and help them as best we can. Thanks, Dave and Errol. Going to go over to Kathy now. Finally, really, a settlement in the Benson family struggle?
Apparently so. They finally announced an agreement last Friday, and the case was set to go to trial on Monday. This is the case involving the shares in the Saints and Pelicans, among other assets that Tom Benson had put in trust for his heirs, his daughter and his two grandchildren, his daughter Renee and his grandchildren Rita and Ryan LeBlanc. And of course, ever since there was the family blow up a few years ago, almost about 2 years ago, Tom Benson had been trying to retrieve all of those assets back from them. The terms of the trust said that he could do that as long as he replaced all of whatever he took out with something, assets of equal value. So all of this case amounted to figuring out what is the equal value for what you want to retrieve, and that was enormously complex because in fact the shares held by those heirs were non-controlling shares, so they didn't have the same value that a controlling share, which Tom had retained all to himself. They were different values, and you had to figure out how far would they be discounted off the controlling shares. So it's a terribly complicated deal, and they had other assets in there as well, including the Benson Tower office building, the Champion Square property, a downtown parking lot, and WVUE TV, which Tom Benson had bought a number of years ago. So all of that was subject to this.
Was this the last legal action, the last suit?
That was the last remaining piece of live litigation. The others had been settled, within the previous year. So I guess what we're left with is they have 60 days the NFL and the NBA both have to sign off on this deal. There's not really any reason to think that they won't, because of course they were well aware of it leading up to it. But the terms of the order of dismissal give them 60 days to approve it. So we may hear something about that, as time goes on, about whether they have done so. But I think none of the parties expect that they will not do that. But we're left with a lot of questions. We still don't know. Did Tom Benson succeed in getting all of those shares in the Saints and Pelicans back in his own hands? Just because they settled doesn't mean that he got everything that he wanted out of it.
But there was a lot of language in the announcement from both sides, but I think from the family side too, assuring that the franchises were going to be in New Orleans, and talking about how important the franchise to the city, and they'll be here, they belong here, and so it seemed like a very positive spin to all of that.
It was definitely so, and it's tempting to read something into that. I was kind of surprised at it, especially coming from the heirs' attorneys. There's a lot of happy talk about the fans of these teams should be very happy that the team is in New Orleans, is going to stay here for a long time, and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, if they don't have any shares anymore, it's odd for them to be saying this. Although, on the other hand, they had been criticized, or there'd been a lot of rumors leading up to this settlement that if the family members got control of the team somehow, the first thing they were going to do was blow town and sell the team or take it somewhere else for sure. So a lot of people thought that to be the case, and the lawyers tried to counter that throughout the litigation. The last 2 years, they tried to say, no, the family always wanted it here. Well, who knows? But so it's tempting to read something into their statement, but it's hard to know exactly.
They talked about the Saints as being one of the most successful franchises in sports. The Pelicans, which we know is struggling a little bit, but it said positive thing about that's a franchise with a real future. So
should we as fans believe that the Saints and the Pelicans are here for the long haul, and that even after Tom Benson is no longer with us, the teams will be?
We'll still be asking that question at that point, I'm sure, because there's just no assurance for any team, honestly. But we know that Tom Benson wanted to, the thrust of this was so that he could leave those teams 100% to his third wife, Gail, at the time of his death. And that was his intent, and that was really what was behind all of this. Whether he succeeded in that, we don't know. We also don't know were there terms written into this agreement that would prevent the heirs from challenging his will at a later date. There could have been language written in there. It doesn't mean that it's, actually going to prevent a challenge.
Let me make two guesses. Okay, first of all, to answer Dave's question, I think the answer is yes, because I don't think there's any way Gail Benson would ever want to sell this franchise. And even if she did, I think that there are people in New Orleans who would rally to be the ones to buy the franchise, and there would be an effort to that. The other thing is, again, just a guess, I know the will was enough of a point of contention that I can't imagine them having a settlement without agreeing on the will question.
Well, but whether it would stand up at a later date is another question. There's just no way to ensure that.
This is something I'm sure that we will be discussing again in weeks to come, because there's a lot of unknowns there. Thanks a lot, Kathy.
Sure.
To move on now, we're going to go to Errol. And just quickly, Errol, we're going to have to talk about council action regarding the travel ban, which the administration says it's not a ban, but they took action on it.
Yeah, it took a strong stand yesterday against the president's order, against or his declaration against travel from certain Muslim nations, and said this is discrimination, and it demanded that the president rescind this. We should notice that the president hasn't followed the council's advice yet. But I think the story
is that a surprise?
I don't mean to get...
You're probably waiting to see what the New Orleans City Council says.
Yeah. I don't mean to get into the pros and cons of this particular issue, but what it made me think about is it's not unusual for a city, because cities are areas that have large ethnic populations, just about every city. So it would be common for the city council of just about any city to be opposed to this, certainly reflecting the attitudes of their constituents. But of all American cities, New Orleans is the one that has the most ethnic heritage to it. When the Louisiana Purchase went through, and all of a sudden New Orleans became part of the United States, this was the first city in the United States that was not English-speaking, that was not a predominantly English-speaking city. It was the first city in the United States in which there were multiple skin colors. It was the first city in the United States in which not everybody was Anglo-Saxon. And so New Orleans was the first city that really, and so to the people, on the East Coast and the Carolinas and all that. I mean, it must have looked like that we purchased a city from another planet at that time. So New Orleans was the ultimate ethnic city. And as the city developed, of course, being a port city, we had a lot of migration into it, the Irish but just to take one group, the Sicilians. New Orleans has the largest Sicilian immigrant population in the nation. It was a huge population. It was a population that had a big impact on the city, a large Irish population, and then of course the population for the West Indies, and so it's always been an ethnically and a racially mixed city, and so it's one that you think would automatically have sympathy for this. But I was just thinking, it's not a surprise that city councils voted against what the president did or taking a stand. But New Orleans is the one that's kind of unique in all of this.
So they're on record saying we don't agree,
right.
Which the action they took yesterday. Action that's coming up on the state level next week, legislature special session deficit that we're facing, no surprise there, and maybe dipping into the rainy day fund, which is what?
Well, this is the 15th mid-year budget cut in the last 9 years, and the big issue with the state legislature facing a mid-year $304 million deficit. It's mid-year because the fiscal year ends on June 30th, and unlike the federal government, the state has to balance its budget. And the biggest issue that the legislature and the governor are facing on Monday, when the special session begins, is do they tap into the rainy day fund? The governor says, yes, we need to do that. He wants to take $119 million out of it, which would be 1/3 of the $360 million that's in the rainy day fund. And again, he wants to take 119 out of the rainy day fund as part of the overall plan to close this $304 million shortfall. He says if you don't take that 119 out of the million out of the rainy day fund, then there's going to have to be big cuts to areas that he doesn't want to cut, which are the state's colleges and universities, K through 12 schools, the families that receive the waivers for their developmentally disabled children. Mm-hmm. So again, that'll be the big issue beginning Monday, and the conservatives in the House do not want the legislature to go along with the plan to tap into that rainy day fund of $119 million.
And of course, that fund was tapped into a lot over these past years.
Right. It had $850 million in 2009 under Governor Jindal. 4 times the legislature, and many Republicans voted for tapping into it under Jindal, and then they took $125 million last year under Governor Edwards. And so, the irony is that the state's budget problems really began under Republican control, with a Republican governor and a Republican legislature. And now Governor Edwards is saying, hey, I'm trying to fix the problem. And the conservatives are saying, well, we really need to cut spending more. That's the solution. The governor's saying, well, what do you want to do to cut spending? And the conservatives in the House have not yet offered a plan on that.
So the governor, though, is saying we still need to get into that rainy day fund. He's not really backing up.
To avoid making $119 million of additional cuts again to the colleges and universities that have been hit so hard in recent years, K through 12 schools and the other programs.
Well, he's tried to raise revenues. He's tried to add additional taxes, and the legislature allowed some of that last year. Right. There were some tax increases, but by and large, the legislature's not in the mood for any large tax increases and have kind of set aside many of the governor's suggested increases in revenues through new taxes. So what's he left to do? He's either going to make deep cuts or have to use the rainy day fund. There's really nothing else to do at that point.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened under Governor Jindal was that the legislature, and he repeatedly tapped into the reserve fund, so there's practically no money left there. And I think ultimately the legislature is reflecting the general will of the people. There is not really a great will for higher taxes to solve these chronic budget problems that the state is now facing.
So Monday the special session starts, and so we'll see what happens during that time. All right, Tyler, thanks. All right, looking to New Orleans East. Errol, you and Kathy wanted to talk a bit about the New Orleans East. It's been hit again, and it's just always faced one challenge after another.
It's a part of the community that's always been challenged economically. And I think one big reason is a geographic one. The Industrial Canal cuts that area off from the rest of the city, and then, of course, over the canal you have the high rise, which in terms of driving over that thing, as we all know, you can run into traffic jams. It's always been an even bigger hurdle than it appears. It has prevented a free flow of traffic back and forth, and it really hampered the development of the economy out there in terms of retail offerings. And even though we at one time had a fairly active mall out there, over time it just didn't work. And it was there was a lot of impoverished community out there, along with a lot of middle class housing, and it just somehow it just never connected, and the thrust was always over on this side of the canal rather than the other side. So I think that was kind of the start of things, and it was a geographic barrier that grew to be more than a geographic barrier.
I think there's a philosophic barrier on top of the geographic barrier, because even you would think a Six Flags amusement park would be wildly successful in a tourism-driven city, in a city that has a large middle class outside of the urban center. But when you can't get people from the North Shore and from the western suburbs, Metairie and Kenner and St. Charles Parish, to even go to the east to go to a Six Flags, how are you going to get people to go to the east to spend money?
Think of how many efforts there have been
anything?
over the years to try to get people over there.
And then, of course, not to mention Katrina, and it was hit
And
so
then
hard,
Katrina.
and the rebound has not been.
But the big hope was, first of all, Michoud. And had there been an active Michoud, had that space program grown, but with the cutbacks on that, that's hurt. But that whole Almanestor industrial park area, it just never developed. Remember there were talks about having a Reno assembly plant and all of these things? All the things that people were hoping.
A movie
Studio.
studio
Well,
there at one point.
yeah, it's going to be good for movie studios, but there's never been those big assembly plants and factories that people were hoping for.
It just never worked.
The fact is, it's sort of an island. People in Broadmoor the other day could have heard that there was a tornado in New Orleans, but it was in eastern New Orleans, not really have felt the impact of it that wasn't there. So.
Well, once again, it's the neighborhood and the homes of many out there who have lost
That
their
was
homes due
terrible.
to this tornado. So, community needs to pull together and help our neighbors. All right, time to look ahead.
The Downtown Development District has started an app called Downtown NOLA, where you can go to and get guidance around the city and tips and everything else. So look for the app. I predict by 2020, everybody will have their own app.
Well, we'll see.
And this is the first step. So.
What will your app be?
Yeah, what will yours be, Tyler? Right now, let's find out. What do you say looking ahead?
Yeah, I'll be in Baton Rouge on Monday, and then for the succeeding days as the legislature begins its special session, I'll be writing stories for The Advocate. And again, the big issue will be whether the conservatives in the State House will go along with the governor's plan to tap into the rainy day fund, because the Senate is supportive of that idea.
All right. Kathy.
The South Market District, downtown New Orleans, is going to grow again. We've talked about it before on this show, and I've been so surprised, that they started the 15-story condominium tower down there, which is, a real surprise that was happening. All of a sudden, they've announced a 29-story tower that is on the books now and ready. They're getting ready to go.
Definitely growing. Dave.
We have some new radio stations in New Orleans. The old 1350 AM, which was most recently 3WL, before that WSMB, is now becoming a hot AC R&B station. It's New Orleans' hottest R&B. That signal will also be on 103.7 FM. Tom Fitzmaurice, Mr. Food, and NBC Sports are moving almost totally digital. He's going to be on HD radio, WWL HD2, and on the app and the website for WWL. We're going to see if we can get people to listen more digitally to radio.
And when does it start?
Today.
Today. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.